Hello everyone. Tonight we are stepping into the glittering world of Regency England to discover what life was really like for the filthy rich. And before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and settle in for a relaxing journey through history. Imagine arriving at a magnificent country estate surrounded by hundreds of acres of land. Long gravel roads lead to a grand mansion with towering columns, enormous windows, and beautifully maintained gardens. To ordinary people, such a home would seem almost like a palace for the wealthiest families of Regency England. However, this was simply everyday life. Wealth during this period was often measured not only by money but by land ownership. A family that controlled thousands of acres could earn huge incomes from tenant farmers who worked the land. These estates passed from generation to generation, allowing aristocratic families to remain powerful for centuries. A young nobleman born into such a family entered the world with advantages most people could never imagine. From childhood, he was surrounded by servants who cleaned his room, prepared his meals, and attended to his needs. Education was often provided by private tutors who taught languages, history, mathematics, and proper social behaviour. Wealthy families expected their children to grow into respectable members of high society. Daily life moved at a slower pace than it did for working people. While labourers woke before sunrise to begin physically demanding jobs, aristocrats could remain comfortably in bed until much later in the morning. Servants quietly prepared breakfast while household staff completed countless tasks behind the scenes. A large estate might employ dozens of workers, including cooks, gardeners, stable hands, maids, footmen, and butlers. Many rich families barely noticed the enormous amount of labour required to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. Fashion played an important role in elite society. Gentlemen spent large sums on tailored coats, polished boots, elegant hats, and imported fabrics. Ladies wore beautiful gowns, inspired by classical styles, and often changed outfits multiple times throughout the day. Looking fashionable was not simply a matter of personal preference. Appearance signalled status, wealth, and social position. A poorly dressed aristocrat risked becoming the subject of gossip among friends and rivals. Social gatherings formed the centre of upper-class life. Invitations to balls, dinners, and private parties were highly valued. Entire families planned their schedules around the social season. These events provided opportunities to strengthen friendships, discuss politics, arrange business connections, and, perhaps most importantly, find suitable marriage partners. Behind the elegance and luxury, however, existed a competitive world where reputation could determine a person's future. Marriage was one of the most important concerns for wealthy families. Unlike the romantic stories often associated with Regency England, many marriages among the upper classes were heavily influenced by money, land, and social status. Parents frequently hoped their children would marry into families of equal or greater wealth. A successful marriage could increase a family's influence and secure its future for generations. Young women entering society were carefully observed at balls and gatherings. Every dance, conversation, and public appearance could affect their reputation. A single rumour had the power to damage marriage prospects. For this reason, Respectable behaviour was constantly expected. Chaperones often accompanied unmarried women to social events, ensuring that proper standards were maintained. Wealth also brought access to entertainment unavailable to ordinary people. Rich families attended the theatre, visited exclusive clubs, enjoyed horse racing events, and travelled between luxurious homes. London became the centre of elite society during the social season. Aristocrats filled the city's finest neighbourhoods, spending enormous sums on housing, clothing, food, and entertainment. Shops offered imported goods from around the world, allowing wealthy customers to purchase rare and fashionable items. Yet, beneath the surface of elegance, many aristocrats faced financial problems. Maintaining large estates, employing numerous servants, and funding extravagant lifestyles required enormous amounts of money. Some families spent far beyond their means in order to maintain appearances. Debt became surprisingly common among members of the upper class. It was possible for a nobleman to live in a grand mansion while secretly owing large sums to creditors. Social pressure encouraged people to appear richer than they actually were. Gambling made these problems even worse. Card games and betting were popular activities among the wealthy. Fortunes could be won or lost in a single evening. Some individuals became obsessed with gambling and accumulated crushing debts. Stories circulated throughout society about aristocrats who lost vast amounts of money through reckless wagers. Political influence represented another advantage enjoyed by the rich. Wealthy landowners often held significant power within local communities and national government. Their opinions carried weight, and their connections opened doors unavailable to most citizens. While ordinary people struggled to make their voices heard, aristocrats frequently shaped laws and policies that affected the entire country. The gap between rich and poor remained enormous. Just beyond the walls of magnificent estates lived labourers, servants, and struggling families whose daily experiences were completely different from those of the aristocracy. Although the wealthy enjoyed luxury and privilege, their world depended heavily upon the work of countless people who possessed far fewer opportunities. Servants formed the invisible foundation of aristocratic life. Guests arriving at a grand estate often admired the beautiful furniture, sparkling chandeliers, and perfectly prepared meals, without considering how much work was required to create such comfort. A large household could employ dozens of servants who worked long hours from early morning until late at night. The butler managed household operations. Maids cleaned rooms, cooks prepared elaborate meals, and footmen attended to guests. Many servants spent their entire lives working behind the scenes, rarely receiving recognition for their efforts. Dining itself was a display of wealth and status. Formal dinners could include numerous courses served on expensive china and silver. Exotic ingredients imported from distant countries impressed guests and demonstrated the host's financial power. Conversation at the table often focused on politics, society, literature, and the latest scandals. Knowing how to behave during these meals was considered an essential skill among the upper classes. A mistake in etiquette could become the subject of gossip for weeks. Travel was another privilege enjoyed by the wealthy. While ordinary people often spent their entire lives close to home, Aristocrats could journey across Britain and even Europe. Comfortable carriages carried them between country estates, fashionable resorts, and the capital city. These journeys provided opportunities to strengthen social connections and experience new places. However, travel could still be slow and uncomfortable compared to modern standards. Roads were not always reliable, and long journeys required careful planning. Despite all their privileges, wealthy families faced constant pressure to maintain their position. Society closely watched their behaviour. Every public appearance, marriage arrangement, financial decision, and social gathering could influence how others viewed them. Reputation remained one of their most valuable possessions. A scandal involving gambling affairs or financial trouble could damage a family's standing for years. Newspapers and gossip networks spread information quickly among elite circles. Some aristocrats became famous, not for their achievements but for their extravagant lifestyles and controversial behaviour. As the years passed, changes slowly began to challenge the traditional world of the Regency elite. Industrial growth created new fortunes outside the old aristocracy. Wealthy businessmen and merchants increasingly competed with ancient noble families for influence and prestige. The social order that had existed for generations was beginning to evolve. Yet, during the Regency era itself, the upper classes still occupied a remarkable position of privilege, living lives that seemed almost unimaginable to the vast majority of the population who worked tirelessly beneath them. For wealthy women, life during the Regency era could appear glamorous from the outside, but it was often filled with restrictions. A lady might live in a magnificent house, wear beautiful gowns, and attend elegant balls. Yet she possessed far less freedom than many people imagine. Society expected women to behave with grace, modesty, and obedience. Their future was often determined by family expectations and marriage prospects, rather than personal ambition. Education for upper-class women focused on accomplishments, considered attractive to potential husbands. Music, drawing, dancing, and polite conversation were encouraged, while serious academic or professional pursuits were rarely expected. Even wealthy women who possessed intelligence and talent frequently found limited opportunities to use them. Meanwhile, wealthy men enjoyed considerably greater freedom. They could manage estates, participate in politics, travel widely, and control family finances. This difference in expectations shaped nearly every aspect of upper-class society. Children raised in aristocratic households grew up in a world very different from that of ordinary families. Nurses and governesses often cared for them during their early years. Young boys were prepared to inherit land and responsibilities, while girls were trained to become respectable wives. Family connections played a crucial role in determining future opportunities. Being born into the right family could open doors that remained permanently closed to others. Religion also occupied an important place in Regency life. Attendance at church was considered both a moral duty and a social expectation. Wealthy families frequently occupied prominent positions within local communities, and public displays of respectability helped protect their reputations. However, private behaviour did not always match public appearances. Like every society, Regency England contained secrets, scandals, and contradictions hidden behind polite smiles and elegant manners. Some aristocrats pursued affairs, accumulated debts, or engaged in reckless behaviour, while carefully maintaining a respectable image in public. The contrast between appearance and reality became one of the defining features of elite society. Visitors might see only luxury and refinement, while hidden beneath the surface were personal struggles, family conflicts, and financial worries. As evening arrived at a great country estate, servants lit candles throughout the house, guests gathered in drawing rooms, and music echoed through elegant halls. To outsiders, the scene appeared perfect. Yet the world of the filthy rich was far more complicated than its beautiful appearance suggested. Behind every grand mansion stood countless stories of ambition, pressure, privilege, and sacrifice that shaped the lives of those who lived within its walls. One of the greatest symbols of wealth during the Regency period was ownership of a grand country estate. These vast properties were more than homes. They represented power, influence, and family history. Some estates had belonged to the same family for centuries. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, reminding each generation of the responsibility to preserve the family name and fortune. Maintaining such an estate required enormous resources. Roofs needed repairs, gardens demanded constant attention, and farmland had to remain productive. Even the richest families sometimes struggled to keep everything running smoothly. A poor harvest or a period of economic difficulty could create serious financial problems. Because appearances mattered so much, many aristocrats continued spending lavishly even when money became tight. Rather than reducing expenses, they often borrowed more money in hopes that circumstances would improve. This created a dangerous cycle that trapped some families in debt for decades. At the same time, life for the lower classes remained incredibly difficult. Farm labourers worked long days in all kinds of weather. Domestic servants performed exhausting tasks with little rest. Factory workers faced harsh conditions as industrialisation slowly expanded across Britain. The contrast between rich and poor could be shocking. A noble family might host an extravagant dinner costing more than a labourer earned in several months. Yet many members of the aristocracy rarely witnessed the harsh realities experienced by ordinary people. Their social circles, homes, and daily routines separated them from much of the population. Charity was common among some wealthy families. Donations to churches, schools, and local communities helped improve their public image while also providing genuine assistance to those in need. However, charity could never fully eliminate the enormous inequalities that defined Regency society. Opportunities remained concentrated among those born into wealth and privilege. As Britain grew increasingly powerful on the world stage, the fortunes of many aristocratic families benefited from trade, empire, and expanding markets. Imported goods from distant lands filled their homes. Tea, sugar, spices, and luxury products became symbols of status. Wealth connected Regency England to a global network of commerce, often in ways that ordinary people barely understood. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on the elegant balls, beautiful fashions, and magnificent houses. Yet the true story of the filthy rich is also a story of expectations. responsibilities, competition, and constant efforts to protect social standing. Their lives were filled with comforts beyond imagination, but they also lived within a system that demanded perfection and judged every mistake. The glittering world of Regency high society was as fragile as it was impressive. Despite all the luxury surrounding them, many members of the Regency elite lived with a constant fear of losing everything. Wealth was often tied to land, investments, and inheritance. A poor financial decision, an expensive legal dispute, or an irresponsible heir could threaten a family's future. Stories circulated about once powerful families forced to sell estates that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. Such losses were deeply embarrassing in a society where status meant almost everything. For this reason, parents paid close attention to how their children behaved and whom they associated with. Family honour was treated as a valuable possession that required careful protection. The younger generation often struggled under these expectations. Young aristocrats were expected to marry well, behave properly, and continue traditions established long before they were born. Some accepted these responsibilities, while others rebelled against them. Certain wealthy heirs became famous for extravagant spending, excessive gambling, and scandalous behaviour. Newspapers and gossip spread stories quickly through fashionable society, turning private mistakes into public entertainment. The social world of Regency England could be surprisingly ruthless. People smiled politely at one another during dinners and dances, but behind closed doors they discussed reputations, fortunes, and family secrets. A careless remark or embarrassing incident could become the talk of London within days. Success depended not only on wealth, but also on navigating a complex network of social relationships. Those who mastered these unwritten rules could rise in influence, while those who failed often found themselves excluded from important circles. Meanwhile, technological and economic changes were slowly transforming Britain. New industries created fortunes for businessmen who had no aristocratic titles. Some traditional nobles looked down on these newcomers, considering them socially inferior despite their wealth. Yet money had a way of changing opinions. Over time, successful industrialists and merchants began entering elite society, challenging the dominance of old aristocratic families. The world was changing, even if many members of the upper class preferred to believe it would remain the same forever. Looking across the Regency era today, we see a fascinating society filled with beauty and contradiction. Grand estates stood beside villages where ordinary people struggled to survive. Lavish parties took place while servants worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Elegant manners concealed fierce competition and personal anxieties. The filthy rich enjoyed privileges beyond imagination, but their lives were also shaped by expectations, obligations, and fears that followed them wherever they went. Beneath the glittering surface, they were still human, navigating a complicated world that was beginning to change around them in ways they could scarcely predict. As the Regency era moved toward its final years, the world of the aristocracy continued to shine with extraordinary wealth and elegance. Magnificent houses remained filled with priceless artwork. Polished silver and luxurious furnishings collected over generations. Guests arriving at these estates often believed they were witnessing the highest form of civilization. Everything appeared organized, refined, and timeless. Yet beneath this polished surface, change was gathering strength. New ideas about society, politics, and opportunity were spreading throughout Britain. More people were beginning to question whether power should belong almost entirely to a small group of wealthy families. For centuries, birth had determined much of a person's future. If you were born into an aristocratic household, opportunities appeared naturally. If you were born poor, life offered far fewer choices. But economic growth was slowly creating a different reality. Successful merchants, bankers, and industrial entrepreneurs accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of ancient noble families. Money alone could not instantly buy aristocratic status, but it could purchase influence, comfort, and access to important social circles. Some members of the old elite adapted successfully to these changes. They invested wisely, embraced new opportunities, and maintained their wealth. Others remained attached to traditions that no longer guaranteed success. The world their ancestors had known was gradually disappearing. Even daily life within grand houses began to evolve. New inventions improved transportation and communication. Travel became easier. News spread more quickly. Society became increasingly connected. The isolation that had once protected aristocratic lifestyles slowly weakened. Meanwhile, younger generations developed different ambitions from their parents and grandparents. Some sought adventure abroad. Others pursued careers, political reforms, or intellectual interests that previous generations might have considered unusual. The rigid expectations of Regency society were beginning to loosen. Yet for many people, the era remained a symbol of elegance and sophistication. Writers, artists, and historians would later look back on Regency England as a world of grand balls, fashionable clothing, romantic estates, and elaborate social customs. Those images contain truth, but only part of the truth. The real story includes hard-working servants, financial struggles, family pressures, social competition, and a society standing on the edge of transformation. The filthy rich enjoyed remarkable privileges, but they also lived in a world that demanded constant attention to reputation, status, and appearance. Their wealth provided comfort and influence, yet it could not protect them from uncertainty or change. Like every generation before and after them, they were living through history without fully realizing how much their world was about to transform. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the wealthy classes of Regency England is how carefully they tried to preserve the image of perfection. Visitors saw elegant drawing rooms filled with laughter, beautiful gardens stretching toward the horizon, and families dressed in the latest fashions. Everything seemed designed to communicate stability, success, and refinement. Yet reality was often far more complicated. Behind closed doors, families argued over inheritances, worried about debts, and struggled with personal disappointments. Some marriages that appeared perfect in public were unhappy in private. Some heirs who seemed destined for greatness lacked the discipline needed to manage their responsibilities. Wealth could solve many problems, but it could not guarantee happiness. Loneliness, anxiety, and family conflict existed even within the grandest mansions. The pressure to maintain appearances sometimes became exhausting. A noble family could not easily admit financial difficulties because doing so might damage their reputation. Instead, they often continued hosting expensive events and living lavishly while secretly worrying about money. Reputation acted almost like a form of currency. Once lost, it was extremely difficult to recover. This created a society where people frequently concealed their true feelings behind polite smiles and perfect manners. The importance of appearance extended beyond individuals to entire families. Every generation carried the responsibility of protecting the family name. Parents hoped their children would make wise choices, avoid scandal, and strengthen the family's position. Success brought pride, while failure could become a source of embarrassment discussed for years. In many ways, aristocratic life resembled a performance in which everyone knew their role and understood the consequences of making mistakes. Yet despite these pressures, many members of the upper classes genuinely enjoyed lives filled with opportunities unavailable to most people. They could read extensive libraries, travel across the country, meet influential figures, and participate in cultural events that shaped the nation. Their homes became centres of social and intellectual activity where important ideas were exchanged. As we look back today, the world of Regency England appears both familiar and distant. Human ambitions, fears, relationships, and dreams remain recognisable. But the social rules governing daily life were very different from those of the modern world. The filthy rich lived in extraordinary comfort, surrounded by privilege and luxury. Yet they were also bound by expectations that influenced nearly every decision they made. Their story reminds us that wealth changes many aspects of life, but it does not eliminate the challenges that come with being human. Even in the most magnificent estates, people still searched for security, purpose, respect, and happiness just as they do today. Another important part of aristocratic life was the constant effort to distinguish themselves from everyone else. Wealthy families did not simply want to be rich. They wanted to be recognised as members of a superior social class. This influenced everything, from the way they spoke to the way they decorated their homes. Certain manners, accents, and customs became markers of status. Even small details could reveal whether someone belonged to high society or was merely trying to imitate it. Social acceptance was often more valuable than money itself. A person might possess a fortune, yet still struggle to gain entry into the most exclusive circles if they lacked the right family connections. This created a world filled with unwritten rules that outsiders found difficult to understand. Invitations to important events became symbols of prestige. Being excluded from them could feel like a public humiliation. During the social season in London, wealthy families attended an endless series of dinners, concerts, balls, and gatherings. These events were not only entertainment. They were opportunities to strengthen alliances, discuss political matters, arrange marriages, and maintain social influence. A successful season could improve a family's standing, while an unsuccessful one might damage it. For young men and women, these gatherings often determined the course of their future lives. Yet, even as the upper classes celebrated their privileges, the wider world continued to change. Improvements in trade and Industry created opportunities for people outside the traditional aristocracy. Ambitious individuals could sometimes build fortunes through business rather than inheritance. This gradual shift challenged the belief that noble birth alone guaranteed superiority. Some aristocrats accepted these changes reluctantly, while others resisted them entirely. They believed the old social order should remain untouched. History, however, rarely stands still. Every generation faces forces that reshape society in unexpected ways. The Regency elite were no exception. Although they appeared powerful and secure, they lived during a period of transition that would eventually transform Britain. Looking back, it is easy to admire the elegance of their world. The grand houses, beautiful clothing, and sophisticated manners continued to capture the imagination. But the true story is richer and more complex. Behind every glittering ballroom stood servants who worked tirelessly. Behind every famous family stood generations of ambition, sacrifice, and careful planning. And behind every display of confidence often existed private worries about reputation, money, and the future. The world of the filthy rich seemed permanent to those living within it. Yet, like every chapter of history, it would eventually fade and give way to something new as evening settled over the countryside. The great houses of Regency England often became even more impressive. Hundreds of candles illuminated hallways, dining rooms, and ballrooms with a warm golden glow. Music drifted through elegant chambers while guests discussed politics, literature, fashion, and the latest news from London. To an observer, it might have seemed the perfect world untouched by hardship. Yet maintaining such an atmosphere required an extraordinary amount of effort. While guests enjoyed themselves upstairs, servants hurried through corridors below, carrying food, cleaning rooms, tending fires, and ensuring that every detail appeared effortless. The comfort of the wealthy depended upon an entire workforce that remained largely invisible. Few aristocrats ever experienced the exhausting labour required to sustain their lifestyle. This separation between classes became one of the defining characteristics of Regency society. People often lived close to one another physically while existing in completely different worlds. A noble family and their servants shared the same estate, yet their daily experiences were vastly different. One group enjoyed luxury and leisure, while the other worked long hours to make that luxury possible. Despite these differences, both groups were connected by a system that had existed for generations. Many people believed it was simply the natural order of society. Education, opportunity, and influence remained concentrated among those born into privilege. Yet, beneath the surface, the foundations of that system were beginning to shift. New economic forces were creating wealth in unexpected places. Cities expanded, businesses grew, and ambitious individuals found ways to improve their position through trade and industry. The old aristocracy still held immense power, but it no longer stood completely alone at the top of society. Some noble families adapted to these changes successfully, investing in new ventures and embracing modern ideas. Others remained attached to traditions that had guided their ancestors for centuries. Their resistance reflected a common human desire to preserve a familiar world. Throughout history, periods of change often create uncertainty, even for those who appear most secure. The wealthy classes of Regency England possessed enormous advantages. But they could not stop time from moving forward. Generations passed, customs evolved, and society slowly transformed around them. The grand estates remained impressive, yet the world beyond their gates was becoming increasingly dynamic and complex. Looking back today, we remember the Regency era for its elegance, refinement, and remarkable displays of wealth. But beneath the beauty stood real people facing real challenges, balancing privilege with responsibility, and trying to secure their place in a rapidly changing world. Their story is not only about riches, it is also about ambition, tradition, adaptation, and the endless passage of history itself. The passing of time eventually revealed an important truth about the wealthy world of Regency England. No matter how grand a family's estate, how impressive their title, or how vast their fortune, nothing remained unchanged forever. Families that once seemed untouchable sometimes faded into obscurity. Estates that had hosted magnificent celebrations occasionally fell into decline. New generations inherited responsibilities they did not always understand or appreciate. Some preserved their family legacy successfully, while others watched it slowly disappear. This cycle had repeated throughout history and would continue long after the Regency era ended. For many aristocrats, preserving the family name became almost an obsession. Portraits of ancestors stared down from mansion walls as constant reminders of past achievements and expectations. Children grew up hearing stories about distinguished relatives who had served kings, won military victories, or expanded the family fortune. These stories inspired pride but also created pressure. Every generation was expected to add something meaningful to the family's history. Failure could feel like a betrayal of those who came before. At the same time, ordinary people were beginning to play a larger role in shaping the future of Britain. Economic growth, technological progress, and social change gradually shifted power away from a small elite and toward a broader section of society. Opportunities remained unequal, but the idea that birth alone should determine a person's destiny slowly faced increasing challenges. The aristocracy remained influential, yet its position was no longer as secure as it had once seemed. Looking at Regency England from a modern perspective, it is tempting to focus only on the glamour, the elegant dancers, luxurious clothing, and magnificent estates continue to fascinate people around the world. However, the deeper story is one of contrasts. Great wealth existed beside poverty. Extraordinary privilege existed beside hard labour. Public confidence often concealed private uncertainty. The lives of the filthy rich were filled with advantages that most people could only dream about. But those advantages came with expectations, responsibilities, and pressures that shaped every aspect of their existence. As candlelight flickered across grand halls and carriages rolled along country roads, the people of Regency England could not know exactly what the future would bring. They simply lived their lives, pursued their ambitions, protected their reputations, and navigated the challenges of their age. In doing so, they left behind a fascinating chapter of history that continues to capture our imagination more than to centuries later. Their world may have vanished, but the stories it produced remain alive. offering a glimpse into one of the most elegant and complex societies Britain ever knew. Even the architecture of Regency England reflected the ambitions of the wealthy. Grand houses were designed not only to provide comfort but also to impress visitors. Large entrance halls, sweeping staircases, elegant libraries, and carefully arranged gardens communicated power and refinement. A visitor's first impression mattered greatly. The appearance of an estate could influence how a family was perceived. Throughout society, wealthy owners invested enormous sums into improving their properties, adding new wings, redesigning landscapes, and filling rooms with expensive art and furniture. These homes became symbols of family prestige that could survive for generations. Yet the beauty of these estates often concealed the immense costs required to maintain them. Repairs were constant, staff had to be paid, and land needed careful management. A single neglected estate could quickly lose its reputation. For this reason, many aristocratic families devoted considerable attention to preserving every detail of their property. The house itself became a reflection of the family's success. Visitors judged not only the building but also the people who lived within it. Hospitality, therefore, played an important role in aristocratic culture. Guests were expected to receive excellent food, comfortable accommodations, and entertaining company. Hosting successful gatherings enhanced social standing and strengthened valuable relationships. Some estates became famous for their parties, attracting influential figures from across the country. Friendships formed during these events could shape political careers, business opportunities, and marriage arrangements. In many case importance, affecting entire communities were discussed during private dinners and social gatherings rather than in public meetings. This gave the wealthy classes influence that extended far beyond their own households. At the same time, their privileged lifestyle depended upon stability. They benefited from a society that rewarded inherited status and respected traditional hierarchies. Any major disruption could threaten their position. As a result, many aristocrats viewed change with caution. They preferred predictability over uncertainty and tradition over experimentation. Yet history rarely moves according to anyone's preferences. Economic developments, political reforms, and social changes gradually altered the balance of power throughout Britain. The younger generation often adapted more easily than their elders, embracing new ideas and opportunities. Some aristocrats even became supporters of reform, recognizing that society could not remain frozen forever. The world they inhabited remained beautiful and impressive, but it was also temporary. Like every great age in history, the Regency era would eventually pass into memory, leaving behind stories, buildings, and traditions that future generations would continue to admire and study. The filthy rich believed they were preserving a timeless way of life, yet they were actually living through one of the many transitions that shaped the modern world. Another fascinating aspect of Regency society was its obsession with etiquette. Rules governed nearly every social interaction. People were expected to know how to greet one another, how to dress for specific occasions, how to behave at dinner, and even how long a visit should last. These customs may seem unnecessary today, but they helped define social status at the time. Someone who failed to follow the rules risked embarrassment and exclusion. Children from wealthy families spent years learning proper behavior so they could move confidently within elite circles. Good manners were viewed almost as a form of education. The ability to conduct oneself correctly opened doors and created opportunities. Reading also became an important pastime among the upper classes. Large private libraries filled many country houses, containing books on history, philosophy, science, travel, and literature. Educated aristocrats often discussed new ideas and current events during social gatherings. Some became patrons of writers, artists, and musicians, helping support cultural developments that would influence future generations. Although entertainment and luxury occupied much of aristocratic life, many wealthy individuals genuinely believed they had responsibilities toward their communities. They funded local churches, supported charities, and sometimes assisted struggling families during difficult times, whether motivated by generosity, duty, or reputation. These actions strengthened their position within society. As the Regency era drew closer to its end, however, the world continued changing around them. New industries expanded, populations grew, and Britain became increasingly modern. The elegant society of balls, carriages, and country estates remained impressive. But it could not remain untouched forever. Future generations would inherit a nation very different from the one their grandparents had known. Yet, for a brief period in history, the filthy rich of Regency England lived in a world defined by extraordinary privilege, refined customs, and immense social influence. Their lives reflected both the greatest advantages and the deepest contradictions of their age, leaving behind a legacy that still fascinates historians and readers today. The influence of the Regency aristocracy extended far beyond their estates and social gatherings. Their decisions often affected entire towns and villages. Large landowners controlled vast areas of the countryside, and many local families depended on them for employment. Farmers rented land from aristocratic estates. Craftsmen supplied goods and services, and countless workers earned there, living through connections to these wealthy households. Because of this, the actions of a single family could shape the economic fortunes of an entire community. A generous landowner might invest in roads, schools, or local improvements, while an irresponsible one could leave tenants struggling. This gave the upper classes significant authority, but it also created expectations that they would act responsibly. Not every aristocrat met those expectations. Some devoted themselves to luxury and entertainment while paying little attention to the people whose labour supported their wealth. Others took their responsibilities seriously and worked to improve conditions on their estates. Their personalities and priorities often determined the quality of life for hundreds of people around them. The countryside itself played a central role in aristocratic identity. Many wealthy families viewed their estates as symbols of stability in a rapidly changing world. Generations had lived on the same land, and preserving that connection became a source of pride. Family histories were closely tied to particular houses, villages, and landscapes. Losing an estate meant losing part of a family's identity. This explains why so many aristocrats fought desperately to maintain their properties even during periods of financial difficulty. Yet despite their efforts, the future could not be controlled completely. Economic shifts, political reforms, and changing social attitudes gradually reshaped Britain. The world of the Regency elite remained impressive, but it was no longer the only path to power and influence. New fortunes continued to emerge, bringing new people into positions of importance. The old aristocracy still commanded respect, but its monopoly on status was beginning to weaken. Looking back, the filthy rich of Regency England occupied a unique moment in history. They stood between an older world, built on inherited privilege, and a newer society increasingly influenced by commerce, industry, and social mobility. Their grand houses, elegant manners, and luxurious lifestyles became lasting symbols of an age that continues to capture the imagination. Yet their true story is about more than wealth. It is the story of a class trying to preserve its place in a world that was slowly, but inevitably, changing around it. As the Regency era continued, many aristocratic families believed their position would last forever. Their estates had survived wars, political changes, and economic difficulties for generations. Massive stone houses stood as symbols of permanence, giving the impression that nothing could ever truly threaten their way of life. Yet history often moves in ways that people cannot predict. The very society that allowed the wealthy to flourish was gradually evolving. More people gained access to education, trade expanded across the globe, and new ideas about opportunity and merit began spreading throughout Britain. These developments did not immediately destroy aristocratic influence, but they slowly changed the rules of society. The younger generation often found itself caught between tradition and modernity. They respected the customs of their parents, yet also lived in a world filled with new possibilities. Some embraced change eagerly, while others worried that the values of the past were disappearing. This tension could be felt throughout Regency society. Even within the grandest households, conversations increasingly touched on the future and what it might bring. Meanwhile, daily life on country estates continued according to familiar routines. Servants prepared meals, gardeners maintained beautiful landscapes, and landowners supervised their properties. Seasons came and went, bringing harvests, celebrations, and social events that marked the rhythm of aristocratic life. To those living within this world, it often felt stable and predictable. Yet beyond the estate gates, Britain was becoming more connected, more industrialised, and more dynamic than ever before. The contrast between the old world and the emerging new one became increasingly visible. Looking back today, the Regency aristocracy occupies a fascinating place in history because it represents both an ending and a beginning. It was one of the last great periods in which inherited status dominated society so completely. Yet it also existed at the dawn of changes that would reshape Britain forever. The filthy rich enjoyed privileges that seem extraordinary from a modern perspective. But they also lived through a time when the foundations of their world were beginning to shift. Their story reminds us that no social order remains unchanged forever. Wealth, influence, and prestige may endure for decades or even centuries, but eventually every generation must adapt to new realities. The aristocrats of Regency England could not stop the future from arriving, no matter how grand their houses or how powerful their names. And that is what makes their world so fascinating to explore today. One reason the Regency era remains so fascinating is that it combined extraordinary beauty with remarkable inequality. Visitors to a grand estate might spend the day admiring elegant architecture, priceless paintings, and carefully landscaped gardens. They would see gentlemen discussing politics in libraries, filled with books, and ladies performing music in beautifully decorated drawing rooms. Everything seemed designed to create an atmosphere of sophistication and culture. Yet only a short distance away, many ordinary people lived far simpler lives. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Wealth allowed aristocratic families to enjoy comforts that most people could barely imagine. They had access to the best food, clothing, education, and entertainment available in Britain. Their children inherited advantages from birth that gave them opportunities throughout life. However, privilege also created expectations. Aristocrats were expected to represent their families with dignity, maintain social connections, and protect their reputation at all costs. Every action could be observed and judged by others within their social circle. This constant scrutiny made private life difficult. Even personal decisions often became public matters. A marriage, a financial mistake, or a family dispute could quickly become the subject of discussion among society's elite because reputation mattered so much. Many people learned to hide their problems behind a carefully constructed image of success. The pressure to appear perfect could be exhausting. Despite these challenges, the upper classes remained influential because they controlled resources, land, and connections that few others possessed. Their homes served as centres of power where important relationships were formed and significant decisions were often discussed. Yet history teaches us that influence is never permanent. New generations bring new ideas, and societies evolve in unexpected ways. The Regency aristocracy appeared powerful and secure, but it existed within a world already beginning to transform. The forces of industry, commerce, and social change were steadily reshaping Britain. While many aristocrats adapted successfully, others struggled to understand the new realities emerging around them. In the end, the story of the filthy rich is not simply about luxury. It is about a class of people trying to preserve a way of life they believed would last forever. Their grand houses, elegant customs, and immense fortunes became symbols of an age that continues to captivate historians and readers alike. Yet their experiences also remind us that even the most privileged societies are subject to change, and that no amount of wealth can stop the passage of time. Perhaps what surprises modern readers most is how much of aristocratic life revolved around appearances. Success was not measured only by wealth, but by how effectively that wealth was displayed. A family might own thousands of acres, yet if their house appeared neglected or their social connections weakened, people would begin to question their status. Image mattered almost as much as reality. This encouraged constant competition among the wealthy. Families compared estates, fashions, carriages, and social achievements. Every gathering became an opportunity to impress others. At the same time, These competitions could become incredibly expensive. Some aristocrats spent fortunes trying to outdo their neighbours, hosting larger parties or purchasing more luxurious possessions. While these displays created an image of endless prosperity, they sometimes concealed serious financial difficulties. Not everyone who appeared rich was actually secure. Some noble families were burdened by debts accumulated over many years. Others relied on inherited wealth that slowly diminished with each generation. Yet, admitting such problems was often unthinkable. Society expected confidence and success, not weakness or failure. As a result, many families continued maintaining expensive lifestyles long after their finances began to suffer. This created a fascinating contradiction. The world of the Regency elite looked stable and powerful from the outside. Yet, beneath the surface, it could be surprisingly fragile. The fortunes of entire families sometimes depended on a successful marriage, a profitable investment, or the responsible actions of a single heir. One poor decision could have consequences lasting decades. Despite these risks, many aristocrats genuinely loved their way of life. They valued tradition, family history, and the sense of belonging that came with membership in elite society. Grand estates connected them to generations of ancestors, while social customs provided structure and identity. To them, preserving these traditions was not merely a matter of pride but a duty. Looking back today, it is easy to understand why the Regency era continues to capture people's imagination. It was a world filled with elegance, ambition, privilege, and drama. Magnificent houses stood amid beautiful landscapes, while powerful families navigated a complex web of relationships and expectations. Yet, beneath all the luxury were ordinary human emotions: hope, fear, love, jealousy, pride, and uncertainty. These emotions connected the aristocrats of Regency England to people in every era. Their wealth may have made their lives extraordinary, but their struggles and dreams remained deeply human, which is why their story still feels alive more than 200 years later. The more closely we examine Regency England, the more we realise that wealth provided access to opportunities that shaped every stage of life. From birth, aristocratic, children entered a world designed to prepare them for positions of influence. They grew up surrounded by tutors, servants, and relatives who taught them the values and expectations of their class. Every lesson, social event, and family connection helped strengthen their place within society. Unlike ordinary people who often had to struggle for survival, the wealthy could devote time to education, travel, and personal interests. This advantage allowed many aristocrats to develop broad knowledge of politics, literature, history, and culture. Yet privilege could also create distance from reality. Some wealthy individuals understood very little about the hardships faced by the majority of the population. Their lives were so comfortable that they rarely experienced the uncertainty that shaped everyday existence for workers, servants, and farmers. This separation sometimes led to misunderstandings between social classes. While aristocrats viewed their position as natural and deserved, others increasingly questioned why so much power and wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a relatively small group. These questions became more common as Britain continued to change. New industries created jobs, cities expanded, and ambitious individuals discovered ways to improve their social standing without relying on noble birth. The traditional aristocracy remained influential, but society was becoming more complex than ever before. Even so, the upper classes continued to dominate many aspects of national life. Their opinions influenced politics, their tastes shaped fashion, and their social networks connected some of the most powerful people in the country. To be accepted within these circles remained one of the highest ambitions for many families. Yet, acceptance often required more than money. It demanded the right manners, connections, education, and reputation. The rules were rarely written down, but everyone understood their importance. This combination of privilege, tradition, and social competition created a world unlike any other. The Regency elite lived at the centre of a society that admired them, depended on them, and increasingly challenged them all at the same time. Their story is fascinating because it captures a moment when old traditions still seemed strong even as the future quietly approached. The grand estates, elegant parties, and powerful families appeared permanent. But history was already preparing the next chapter, and like every generation before them, the wealthy of Regency England would eventually discover that no amount of status or fortune could prevent the world from changing. By the early 19th century, Britain had become one of the most powerful nations in the world, and the aristocracy benefited greatly from that success. Trade connected the country to distant continents, bringing wealth, luxury goods, and new opportunities. Tea from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean, fine fabrics, spices, and countless other products found their way into aristocratic homes. These imported goods became symbols of refinement and status. Guests at a grand dinner might enjoy foods and drinks that had travelled thousands of miles before reaching the table. Such luxuries reminded everyone of the wealth and influence that Britain possessed during this period. Yet many people enjoyed these benefits without fully understanding vast global systems that made them possible. Life inside a great estate could feel remarkably self-contained. Days were filled with familiar routines, social obligations, and family responsibilities. Seasons changed, children grew older, and generations followed one another in an almost predictable pattern. This sense of continuity gave aristocratic families confidence that their way of life would endure indefinitely. However, history rarely allows any social order to remain unchanged forever. The same economic growth that increased national prosperity also created new sources of wealth outside the traditional aristocracy. Talented businessmen, manufacturers, and investors accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of ancient noble families. Their success demonstrated that power was no longer determined entirely by birth. Some aristocrats welcomed these newcomers, while others viewed them with suspicion. The boundaries between old and new wealth became an important topic of discussion throughout society. At elegant gatherings, conversations often reflected these broader changes. Guests debated politics, international events, and economic developments while enjoying luxurious surroundings. Although the atmosphere remained sophisticated, many people sensed that Britain was entering a new era. The world was becoming faster, larger, and more connected than previous generations could have imagined. Even the most powerful families could not remain completely isolated from these transformations. Looking back now, we can see that the Regency elite stood at a crossroads between tradition and modernity. Their lives represented the peak of an older social order, built upon inherited privilege. Yet they also witnessed the early signs of a future shaped by new ideas and opportunities. This unique position makes their story especially fascinating. They lived in extraordinary comfort and influence, surrounded by beauty and prestige, while unknowingly standing on the threshold of profound historical change that would reshape Britain for generations to come. For all their influence and privilege, the aristocrats of Regency England remained deeply concerned with one question: what would happen after they were gone? Legacy mattered enormously. Wealthy families spent generations building fortunes, expanding estates, and strengthening their social position. Everything they accomplished was intended not only for themselves, but for their descendants. Fathers hoped to pass prosperous estates to their sons. Mothers worked to secure advantageous marriages for their daughters. Every major decision was made with the future of the family in mind. This long-term thinking shaped aristocratic culture in powerful ways, unlike people focused only on immediate concerns. The upper classes often planned decades ahead. They viewed themselves as temporary guardians of family property, rather than simple owners. The estate had existed before them and, ideally, would continue long after their deaths. This sense of continuity gave aristocratic life a unique character. Portraits, heirlooms, and family records connected each generation to those who came before. A noble house was more than a residence. It was a symbol of family identity stretching back through time. Yet preserving such a legacy was never easy. Every generation faced new challenges: economic downturns, poor investments, political changes, and personal mistakes. All had the potential to weaken what previous generations had built. Some heirs proved wise and capable, while others wasted fortunes through carelessness or extravagance. As a result, aristocratic history is filled with both great successes and dramatic declines. Families that seemed invincible sometimes disappeared within only a few generations. Others adapted successfully and maintained their influence for centuries. These stories reveal how fragile even great wealth can be. Looking across Regency England as a whole, we see a society defined by ambition, tradition, privilege, and constant effort. The filthy rich lived in magnificent surroundings, enjoyed extraordinary opportunities, and possessed influence that reached far beyond their estates. Yet they also carried heavy expectations and responsibilities. Their world was beautiful, but it demanded constant maintenance. Their position was powerful, but never completely secure. And while they often believed their way of life would endure forever, history had different plans. The elegant age of Regency England would eventually pass, leaving behind grand houses, fascinating stories, and a legacy that continues to capture the imagination of people around the world more than 2 centuries later. As historians look back on the Regency period today, they often see more than just wealth and elegance. They see a society attempting to balance old traditions with a rapidly changing future. The aristocracy occupied the highest levels of that society, enjoying privileges that few others could imagine. Their lives were filled with luxury, influence, and opportunity. Yet they were also shaped by rules, expectations, and responsibilities that could not easily be escaped. Every aspect of life, from education and marriage to politics and property, was connected to maintaining family status. Success brought admiration, while failure could damage a reputation built over generations. This constant pressure influenced how aristocrats thought, behaved, and planned for the future. Even leisure activities often served practical purposes. A dinner party could strengthen political alliances. A ball could lead to a marriage arrangement. A visit to a neighbouring estate could reinforce important social connections. Nothing existed entirely separate from the larger network of relationships that defined elite society. At the same time, many members of the aristocracy genuinely believed they were fulfilling an important role within the nation. They saw themselves as leaders, guardians of tradition, and examples for others to follow. Whether this belief was always justified remains a matter of debate, but it undeniably shaped how they viewed the world around them. Their confidence came from generations of influence and success. Yet beneath that confidence existed uncertainty. New industries, new ideas, and new social groups were steadily changing Britain. The future would not look exactly like the past. Looking back now, the Regency elite appear almost like characters from another world. Their carriages, grand houses, formal manners, and elaborate social customs seem distant from modern life. Yet the emotions that guided them remain familiar. They worried about family, sought respect, protected their reputations, pursued success, and hoped to leave something meaningful behind. In said sense, they want people today. The world they inhabited may have vanished, but the human stories within it continue to resonate. That is why the filthy rich of Regency England remain such a fascinating subject. Their lives reveal not only how wealth and privilege shaped society, but also how people navigate change, responsibility, ambition, and the passage of time. Through their triumphs and failures, we gain a deeper understanding of an age that stood between the traditions of the past and the modern world that was slowly emerging. Beyond the horizon, perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from the wealthy families of Regency England is that power and privilege are never as permanent as they appear. To those living in grand estates surrounded by servants, luxury, and influence, their world seemed stable and secure. Generations before them had enjoyed similar advantages, and many assumed future generations would do the same. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that every society changes. Economic shifts, technological progress, and new social ideas gradually reshape even the most established systems. The aristocracy of Regency England possessed enormous resources, but they could not stop these larger forces. Over time, opportunities became available to a wider range of people. Wealth no longer flowed exclusively through inherited land and noble titles. Business, industry, and innovation opened new paths to success. The social landscape became more competitive and dynamic. Families that adapted survived and often prospered. Those that resisted change sometimes struggled to maintain the position they once considered guaranteed. This process did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually across decades, often so slowly that people living through it barely noticed. Yet looking back, the transformation becomes clear. The Regency elite occupied a remarkable moment between two worlds. One world was built upon ancient traditions, inherited status, and strict social hierarchies. The other was moving toward a future shaped increasingly by commerce, industry, and personal achievement. The aristocrats stood at the centre of this transition, benefiting from the old system while witnessing the first signs of the new one. Their experiences provide a unique window into how societies evolve over time. Beyond the politics and economics, however, their story remains deeply human. They celebrated victories, endured disappointments, formed friendships, worried about their children, and wondered what the future would bring. They laughed at parties, argued over family matters, and dreamed of leaving behind a lasting legacy. Wealth made their lives unusual, but it did not make them immune to the universal experiences shared by all generations. This combination of extraordinary, privilege, and ordinary human emotion is what makes the Regency aristocracy so fascinating. Their world may seem distant today, filled with customs and traditions that no longer exist. Yet their hopes and fears remain surprisingly familiar. Through their lives, we see not only the history of a wealthy class, but also a timeless story about ambition, change, family, and the passage of time itself. As the years passed, many of the great estates that symbolised Regency wealth continued to dominate the countryside. Their owners remained influential figures, respected by some and envied by others. Yet, even within these magnificent homes, life was not always as effortless as it appeared. Running a large estate required organisation, discipline, and careful financial management. Land had to remain productive. Buildings required constant maintenance, and dozens of employees depended upon the estate for their livelihood. A successful landowner needed more than a famous name. He needed practical skills and sound judgment. Those who neglected these responsibilities sometimes discovered that even great fortunes could disappear surprisingly quickly. This reality created an interesting contrast between appearance and substance. Society admired elegance, but long-term success often depended on less glamorous qualities such as patience, responsibility, and planning. Many aristocratic families understood this lesson well. They carefully managed their resources and adapted to changing circumstances. Others focused too heavily on luxury and reputation, believing their status alone would protect them. History proved otherwise. Throughout Britain, examples could be found of noble families that rose to great prominence only to decline because of poor decisions or changing economic conditions. At the same time, ambitious individuals from less privileged backgrounds continued finding new ways to improve their position. This gradual shift helped reshape the nation. The idea that success should depend entirely upon birth became increasingly difficult to defend. New opportunities encouraged people to believe that talent, effort, and innovation could also lead to achievement. The old aristocracy remained powerful, but it no longer stood completely alone at the top of society. Looking back on the Regency era today, we often remember its elegance first. The graceful fashions, beautiful architecture, and sophisticated social customs continue to capture the imagination. Yet beneath those famous images lies a more complex story about adaptation and survival. The filthy rich were not merely enjoying luxury. They were also navigating a world that was slowly changing around them. Some recognized these changes and adjusted accordingly. Others clung to traditions that were losing their influence. Together, their experiences reveal how even the most privileged groups must eventually confront the realities of a changing world. Their story reminds us that wealth may provide comfort and opportunity, but it does not exempt anyone from history. Every generation inherits a world shaped by the past and must find its own way to face the future. The story of the Regency aristocracy also reveals how closely wealth was connected to influence. Money provided comfort, but influence allowed families to shape the world around them. Through political connections, land ownership, and social networks, many aristocrats played important roles in local and national affairs. Their opinions carried weight because their status commanded attention. A recommendation from a respected nobleman could open doors, create opportunities, or influence important decisions. This network of relationships formed one of the foundations of elite society. Families spent years building connections and maintaining friendships because they understood how valuable those relationships could be. Yet influence, like wealth, required constant effort to preserve. A damaged reputation could weaken even the most powerful family standing. For that reason, aristocrats paid careful attention to how they were perceived by others. Public behaviour mattered greatly. Acts of generosity improved reputations, while scandals could spread rapidly through society. Newspapers, letters, and personal conversations carried news across the country faster than many people realise. The upper classes lived under constant observation from their peers. Every success attracted admiration and every mistake attracted criticism. Despite these pressures, many aristocrats genuinely enjoyed their lives. They hunted, travelled, attended cultural events, collected art, and participated in social traditions that brought excitement and purpose to their daily routines. Their world offered experiences unavailable to most people, yet it also demanded discipline, maintaining an estate, managing finances, protecting family interests, and preparing future generations for leadership required significant effort. The most successful families understood that privilege alone was not enough. It had to be supported by responsibility and careful planning. As Britain continued moving toward a more modern age, these lessons became increasingly important. The future would reward adaptability more than tradition alone. Some aristocratic families recognized this reality and evolved with the times. Others struggled to accept the changes occurring around them. Looking back today, the Regency elite appear both powerful and vulnerable at the same time. They possessed extraordinary advantages, yet they lived in a world that was slowly transforming beneath their feet. Their story reminds us that every generation, no matter how wealthy or influential, must eventually face new challenges. The grand houses, elegant fashions, and luxurious lifestyles of Regency England remain fascinating symbols of the past. But the deeper story is about people trying to preserve their place in a changing world. Said struggle more than any mansion or title is what truly connects their lives to ours. Another reason the Regency aristocracy continues to fascinate historians is the contrast between what people saw and what they rarely discussed. Visitors arriving at a grand estate witnessed polished elegance, confident hosts, and a lifestyle that seemed almost effortless. Yet maintaining that image required constant work. Families carefully managed their public appearances because reputation could influence everything from marriage, prospects to political opportunities. A single scandal had the potential to overshadow years of success. As a result, many aristocrats became experts at presenting an ideal version of their lives to the outside world. Private worries were often hidden behind smiles and good manners. Financial concerns, family disagreements, and personal disappointments remained concealed whenever possible. This culture of discretion became one of the defining characteristics of elite society. It allowed families to preserve their status even during difficult times. At the same time, it sometimes prevented people from seeking help when they needed it most. The pressure to appear successful could be overwhelming. Nevertheless, the aristocracy remained remarkably resilient. Generations learned how to navigate changing circumstances while preserving the traditions that gave their lives meaning. They adapted to economic challenges, political reforms, and shifting social expectations without completely abandoning their identity. This ability to balance continuity and change helped many noble families survive long after the Regency era ended. Their estates evolved, their sources of income diversified, and their roles within society gradually transformed. Yet traces of the old world remained visible. Ancient houses still stood across the countryside. Family portraits continued to decorate grand halls, and stories of past generations were passed down through the years. These reminders connected people to a history that stretched far beyond their own lifetimes. Lavish. The world of the filthy rich appears almost like a bridge between two eras. One side was rooted in tradition, inherited privilege, and centuries-old customs. The other pointed toward a modern society shaped increasingly by industry, commerce, and new opportunities. The aristocrats of Regency England stood in the middle of that bridge, enjoying the advantages of the past while unknowingly moving toward a very different future. Their lives reveal how history rarely changes all at once. Instead, it unfolds gradually through countless small shifts that accumulate over time. By understanding their experiences, we gain insight not only into a fascinating period of British history, but also into the ways societies adapt, evolve, and reinvent themselves across generations. By the end of the Regency period, the aristocracy still occupied an impressive position within British society, but the world around them no longer looked exactly as it had at the beginning of the era. New wealth continued to emerge, cities grew larger, and ideas about opportunity and progress spread across the country. The great families remained influential, yet they increasingly shared the national stage with businessmen, industrialists, and professionals whose success came from enterprise rather than inheritance. This gradual shift marked the beginning of a new chapter in British history. For the aristocracy, adapting to these changes became essential. Some embraced innovation and found new ways to maintain their prosperity. Others remained attached to old assumptions and struggled as society evolved. The difference between these approaches often determined whether a family flourished or declined. Yet, regardless of their individual fortunes, the Regency elite left a lasting mark on Britain. Their architecture, literature, customs, and social traditions influenced generations that followed. Many of the grand estates built or expanded during this period still stand today, attracting visitors from around the world. Walking through these magnificent houses, it is easy to imagine the lives once lived within them. The candlelit dinners, elegant dances, political discussions, and family celebrations all seem to echo through the halls. Yet the true significance of the Regency aristocracy lies not only in its wealth or beauty, it lies in what their experiences reveal about society itself. Their world demonstrates how power is maintained, how traditions are preserved, and how change gradually transforms even the most established institutions. The filthy rich of Regency England appeared to live in a world apart, but they were deeply connected to the broader forces shaping their nation. Economic growth, social change, and political developments affected them just as surely as they affected everyone else. Their privilege gave them advantages, but it did not place them outside history. Looking back now, we can admire the elegance of their age while also recognizing its complexities. Behind every grand estate stood generations of ambition and effort. Behind every title stood expectations and responsibilities. And behind every display of confidence stood individuals facing the uncertainties of their own time. Their story remains compelling because it combines luxury with humanity, privilege with vulnerability, and tradition with transformation. It reminds us that even the most powerful people are ultimately part of the larger story of history, shaped by forces far greater than themselves. The legacy of the Regency aristocracy continued long after the era itself had ended. Future generations looked back on this period with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Writers described its elegant society. Artists painted its grand houses. And historians studied the people who occupied its highest ranks. The image of Regency England became associated with refinement, sophistication, and luxury. Yet the reality was always more complicated than the image. Behind the beautiful fashions and magnificent estates stood a society built upon strict social divisions and unequal opportunities. The wealthy enjoyed privileges unavailable to most of the population, but they also carried burdens that came with maintaining status and influence. Their lives were shaped by expectations that governed everything, from marriage to daily behaviour. Even personal happiness was often balanced against family duty and social responsibility. This tension between individual desires and public obligations defined much of aristocratic life. Some embraced their role enthusiastically, while others quietly wished for greater freedom. As Britain entered a new age, many of these traditions began to soften. Society became more flexible, and opportunities gradually expanded beyond the old elite. Yet the memory of the Regency aristocracy remained powerful, because it represented the final flowering of a world that had dominated Britain for centuries. Their estates, traditions, and customs became symbols of a bygone era. Today, when people imagine Regency England, they often picture elegant ballrooms, graceful dancers, and magnificent country houses. Those images are part of the story, but they are only the surface. Beneath them lies a deeper history of ambition, responsibility, competition, and change. The filthy rich lived extraordinary lives, surrounded by comforts that most people could scarcely imagine. Yet they were still subject to the same forces that shape every human life. They worried about the future, protected their families, pursued their goals, and adapted to a world that never stopped changing. In the end, their greatest lesson may be that wealth and status can influence history, but they cannot escape it. Every generation, no matter how powerful, eventually becomes part of the past. The aristocrats of Regency England once stood at the centre of their world, believing their influence would endure forever. Today, their houses, portraits, and stories remain, offering us a fascinating glimpse into a society that has vanished but continues to capture our imagination centuries later. Yet, perhaps the most enduring reason people remain fascinated by the Regency aristocracy is because their world feels both distant and familiar at the same time. The grand estates, elegant clothing, horse-drawn carriages, and formal social customs belong to a different age. Yet the people who lived within that world faced challenges we still recognise today. They worried about their futures, hoped their children would succeed, struggled with expectations, and searched for happiness within the limits placed upon them by society. Wealth gave them advantages, but it did not free them from uncertainty. A family could possess enormous estates and still fear financial decline. A young woman could enjoy every luxury imaginable and still have little control over important decisions affecting her life. A powerful nobleman could influence politics and society while privately worrying about his reputation or legacy. These contradictions made aristocratic life far more complex than many people imagine. The Regency era was not simply a time of luxury. It was a time of transition, ambition, and adaptation. Old traditions remained strong, but new ideas were beginning to challenge them. Some families embraced change and found ways to thrive in the modernising world. Others resisted and gradually lost influence. Throughout this process, the aristocracy continued, trying to preserve the values and customs that had defined their identity for generations. Looking back today, we can see both the strengths and weaknesses of their society. We can admire their achievements while also recognising the inequalities that existed beneath the surface. The magnificent houses, beautiful gardens, and elegant lifestyles were real, but so were the pressures, responsibilities, and social divisions that shaped everyday life. History rarely presents simple stories, and the world of the filthy rich is no exception. It was a world of privilege and pressure, luxury and obligation, confidence and uncertainty. That combination is what makes it so compelling to explore. More than 200 years later, the people of Regency England continue to capture our imagination because their lives reveal timeless truths about power, status, family, and change. Their age may have ended, but the questions they faced remain surprisingly relevant, reminding us that every generation, no matter how wealthy or influential, must eventually confront the future and adapt to a world that never stands still. As we continue exploring this remarkable period, it becomes clear that the Regency aristocracy was living through one of the last great ages of traditional noble power. For centuries, land had been the foundation of wealth. Owning vast estates meant controlling resources, influencing local communities, and securing a family's future. But by the early 19th century, Britain was beginning to change in ways that would eventually reduce the dominance of landowners, factories, trade networks, and financial institutions were creating new forms of wealth. Success increasingly depended not only on inheritance but also on investment, innovation, and business. Some aristocrats recognized these changes early and adapted successfully. They invested in industry, supported infrastructure projects, and embraced economic opportunities beyond their estates. Others remained committed to older traditions and found it difficult to understand the rapidly changing world around them. This divide would become increasingly important as the century progressed. Yet during the Regency years themselves, the aristocracy still enjoyed extraordinary prestige. Their homes remained centres of influence. Their opinions shaped public discussions, and their social gatherings attracted the most important figures of the age. To be accepted into these circles was considered a great achievement. Even wealthy newcomers often sought the approval of established noble families, because status carried a value that money alone could not easily purchase. This reveals an important truth about Regency society. Wealth and power were connected, but they were not exactly the same thing. A person could become rich relatively quickly, but earning social respect often required generations. Family history, reputation, and connections remained enormously important. The aristocracy understood this and guarded their status carefully. Their world operated according to rules developed over centuries, and membership in elite society required more than financial success. Looking back now, we can appreciate how unique this moment in history truly was. The Regency elite stood at the peak of a social order that had shaped Britain for generations. Their influence seemed secure. Their traditions appeared timeless, and their estates dominated the landscape. Yet beneath the surface, powerful forces were already transforming the nation. The future would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new definitions of success. The aristocrats could not stop these changes, but they would play an important role in shaping how Britain adapted to them. Their story, therefore, becomes not only a tale of wealth and privilege, but also a story about a society standing at the edge of a new age. For many members of the aristocracy, one of the greatest challenges was preparing the next generation to inherit both privilege and responsibility. Parents understood that wealth could be lost as easily as it was gained if future heirs lacked discipline or good judgment. Young men were expected to learn how to manage estates, oversee finances, and represent the family in public life. Young women were taught the social skills necessary to navigate elite society successfully. Education, manners, and reputation were considered essential investments in the future. Every generation carried the hopes of those who came before it. Success strengthened the family legacy, while failure could place everything at risk. This sense of responsibility influenced many aspects of aristocratic life. Decisions were rarely made with only the present in mind. Families constantly thought about how their choices would affect future generations. Large estates were maintained, not simply for personal enjoyment, but as symbols of continuity and stability. Portraits of ancestors hanging on the walls reminded family members that they were part of a much larger story stretching back through centuries. These connections to the past gave aristocratic life a unique sense of identity. Yet they could also create pressure. Some heirs felt trapped by expectations they had never chosen. Others embraced their responsibilities with pride. The balance between personal freedom and family duty remained a recurring theme throughout Regency society. At the same time, Britain itself continued evolving. New ideas about government, economics, and social mobility gained support. The nation was becoming more complex, and traditional elites increasingly found themselves sharing influence with new groups. The aristocracy remained powerful, but its position was no longer unquestioned. This gradual shift did not immediately transform society, but it signalled that the future would look different from the past. Looking back, the Regency era represents a fascinating moment when old and new worlds existed side by side. Ancient traditions still shaped daily life, yet modern forces were already beginning to reshape the nation. The filthy rich stood at the centre of this transformation. Their wealth gave them remarkable opportunities, but it could not shield them from change. Their story is therefore about far more than luxury. It is about adaptation, legacy, ambition, and the challenge of preserving identity in a world that never stops moving forward. Through their experiences, we gain a deeper understanding of how societies evolve and how even the most powerful people must eventually face the realities of a changing age, the changing nature of wealth during the Regency era created opportunities that would have seemed impossible only a few generations earlier. For centuries, aristocratic power had rested largely on land ownership. Vast estates produced income, provided influence, and secured a family's position within society. However, as Britain's economy expanded, new sources of wealth began emerging. Banking, trade, shipping, manufacturing, and investment allowed ambitious individuals to build fortunes outside the traditional aristocratic system. This development slowly altered the balance of society. Some noble families viewed these newcomers with suspicion, believing that true status could only come through birth and heritage. Others recognized that the future belonged to those willing to adapt, as or result. Alliances formed between old aristocratic families and newly wealthy individuals. Marriages, business partnerships, and social connections helped bridge the gap between established privilege and emerging prosperity. These relationships reshaped British society in subtle but important ways. Meanwhile, daily life on many estates continued much as it always had. Servants carried out their duties, tenants worked the land, and social events filled the calendar. Yet beneath these familiar routines, the foundations of society were shifting. New technologies improved transportation and communication. News travelled faster than before. People became increasingly aware of events occurring far beyond their local communities. The world felt larger and more connected with each passing year. Even those who preferred tradition could not completely escape these changes. The Regency aristocracy often appeared confident and secure, But many understood that the future would not simply repeat the past. Some prepared carefully, investing wisely and encouraging their children to develop practical skills alongside social accomplishments. Others relied too heavily on inherited prestige, assuming their position would remain unchanged forever. History would ultimately reward those who adapted most successfully. Looking back today, the world of they, filthy rich, remains fascinating because it captures a society in transition. The grandeur, elegance, and privilege associated with the Regency era were real, but they existed alongside uncertainty and transformation. Aristocrats enjoyed extraordinary advantages, yet they were also witnessing the gradual emergence of a new Britain. Their experiences remind us that even the most powerful groups cannot remain completely separate from the forces shaping the wider world. Wealth may provide comfort, influence, and opportunity, but it cannot stop history from moving forward. Every generation must find a way to adapt, and the Regency elite were no exception. Their story continues to endure because it reveals both the strengths and limitations of privilege during a remarkable period of change. Although the Regency aristocracy occupied the highest levels of society, they could never completely separate themselves from the events shaping the nation around them. Wars, economic fluctuations, harvest failures, and political debates all influenced their lives in one way or another. Wealth provided protection from many hardships, but it did not create complete immunity from uncertainty. A decline in agricultural income could affect state finances. Political reforms could alter traditional sources of influence. International events could impact trade and investment. The most successful aristocratic families understood that survival required awareness as well as privilege. They paid attention to changing conditions and adjusted their strategies accordingly. This ability to adapt often determined whether a family prospered or declined over the long term. At the same time, aristocratic culture continued emphasizing values such as honor, duty, and respectability. These ideals were not always followed perfectly, but they remained important standards by which people judged themselves and others. Public reputation carried enormous weight. A person known for integrity and responsibility could gain admiration throughout society, while someone associated with scandal risked losing influence regardless of wealth. This emphasis on character reflected the belief that privilege came with obligations. Many aristocrats genuinely saw themselves as caretakers of their communities, responsible for maintaining stability and supporting those who depended on them. Whether they always fulfilled these duties is another question, but the expectation itself remained powerful. Looking back now, the Regency elite appear as participants in a remarkable historical moment. They inherited traditions that had shaped Britain for centuries. Yet they also witnessed the early stages of changes that would transform the nation forever. Their grand houses, elegant lifestyles, and social influence represented the peak of one era, while the economic and social developments occurring around them pointed toward another. This combination of continuity and change gives the Regency period its unique character. The filthy rich enjoyed advantages that few people could imagine, but they also faced challenges that required intelligence, adaptability, and resilience. Their world was beautiful and impressive, yet it was never as stable as it appeared. Beneath the elegance lay a constant effort to preserve status, protect family interests, and prepare for an uncertain future. Insetzense there's about wealth. It is about how people respond when the world around them begins to change, even while everything on the surface seems exactly the same. And so, as the lights slowly fade in the grand ballrooms of Regency England and the last carriage disappears down a quiet country road, we reach the end of our journey through the world of the filthy rich. Their lives were filled with elegance, privilege, and opportunity. They lived in magnificent houses, attended glittering social events, and possessed a level of influence that most people could only dream about. Yet beneath the polished surface, their world was far more complicated than it appeared. They worried about reputation, protected family legacies, struggled with expectations, and faced an uncertain future, just like every generation before and after them. The great estates that once seemed permanent eventually changed. The social rules that governed society gradually evolved. New ideas, new industries, and new opportunities transformed Britain in ways that few people could have predicted. The aristocrats of Regency England stood at the peak of an old world, unaware that history was already preparing a new one. Today, many of their houses still stand across the English countryside. Their portraits still hang on ancient walls, and their stories continue to fascinate people around the world. They remind us that wealth can create comfort, influence, and prestige, but it cannot stop time. Every generation believes its world will last forever. Yet history teaches us that change eventually comes to all societies. The true legacy of the Regency elite is not simply their fortune or their titles. It is the window they provide into a remarkable age of beauty, ambition, tradition, and transformation. Through their lives, we see how people strive to preserve what they value most while adapting to a future they cannot fully see. And as we close this chapter of history, we are left with a simple reminder. Grand houses may fade, fortunes may rise and fall, and entire social orders may disappear. But the hopes, fears, dreams, and ambitions of people remain surprisingly constant across the centuries. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Regency England. Now, as the candles burn low and the night grows quiet, you can rest knowing that another fascinating chapter of history has gently drifted into the past.